Welcome to The Debate. Our source material today takes us deep into the mechanics of xenogeneic survival, specifically this concept of xenogeneic overreaction, how non-normative evolutionary lineages manage to persist. And it's all centered on this really radical notion of the iterative crystal.
Right, and the iterative crystal is maybe the most challenging idea in the whole text, because what it describes is a mechanism of repetition that deliberately iterates without converging, without optimizing. And crucially, it's a system where error isn't purged. It's intensified, it's preserved, and it becomes the actual engine of agency.
Absolutely. It just flips so much of traditional evolutionary thinking on its head. And so the central question that I think we have to grapple with today is whether the persistence of life under this kind of chaotic pressure relies fundamentally on that accidental, non-optimized process of unfounded iteration and metabolic necessity, or if the crucial life-preserving mechanism is something more like active narrative resistance and education, something achieved through what the text calls poetics.
And I'm going to argue that survival is, profoundly driven by that accident, by error amplification, and by this inescapable metabolic participation. From my point of view, these human-centric structures like poetics, they're really secondary symptoms. They're downstream effects of a much deeper infectious mediation that operates totally outside of our intentional control.
And I'll be taking the position that no, survival is channeled through active intentional resistance and these structures of re-expression. This poetics is what converts that accidental exposure into usable knowledge, into learning. It insists on an element of agency in defining the terms of persistence. And that's what prevents a total entropic collapse into just, meaningless repetition. So when the material frames persistence as a victory of re-expression over closure, that for me is a signal that pure accident just isn't enough for long-term survival. The text requires some kind of structured mechanism for processing all that error. And this is where bird poetics comes in. These structures of re-expression that migrate across planetary scales, and they're explicitly defined as an immunization mechanism. Poetry here isn't just decoration. It's conceptualized as a vaccine without antigen, an active education of response. It attenuates virulence not by killing the pathogen, but by rephrasing its meaning within the host system.
Right, I understand the appeal of defining that necessary structure as poetics, but I really think that misattributes the source of the power. The defining characteristic of xenogeneic survival is the stuttering of the crystal, that repetition without closure. Power accrues not from this structured optimization that you're advocating for, but from unfounded iteration, which, contaminates the transition probabilities. If this contamination were just some necessary input to be managed, the system would try to minimize it. But instead, pharmacological sophistication is explicitly described as inseparable from accident, from misbinding, from cryptic errors that are actively preserved, not corrected.
But the preservation of error demands a framework of exchange. It can't just be noise. This is why the text ties sovereignty not to command, but to resistance, specifically psychological resistance to deterministic algorithms. Life remains iterable and poetic only if it actively resists that kind of algorithmic certainty. This mechanism demands exchange rather than possession. And it's consistent with Schelling's monistic turn, reading recombination and transplantation as symbioses, which indicates a structured, even ethical path toward co-constitution, rather than just, accidental contamination.
That reliance on conscious psychological resistance seems to ignore the fundamental displacement described in the material, though. The whole anthropocentric view of mastery is, it's displaced entirely by the choreography of vectors, arthropod fusion, primate planets, craft infects. These systems operate based on necessary metabolic integration, not persuasion or ethical choice. So while poetics exist, sure, there's symptoms of the mediation. When a conchamoeba speaks by hosting, it's a passive linguistic act. Systemic role-playing reverses authorship. The mechanism is fundamentally non-human. It originates from outside our normative lineages, which suggests to me that accident and systemic necessity are the primary uncontrollable forces at play.
Okay, let's drill down into the locus of agency. I stand by the claim that the iterative crystal intensifies error into agency. This agency is emerged from biological noise.
We see this in the overreaction to excursions in the secretory dimension, which amplifies tiny microvariations into these huge macroscopic reorganizations. The system is defined by its involuntary stochastic power. That, to me, is true xenogeneic agency.
That's a powerful reading of emergence, I'll grant you that. But the question for me remains, what makes that emergent error sustainable rather than simply destructive? Error is the raw material, yes, but the crystal's iteration has to be mediated to be useful. Bird poetics provide that vector for mediation, converting raw exposure into learning. The difference between a pure, destructive viral infection and a regulated, life-sustaining survival. It hinges on whether that exposure is just repeated, trapped in those endless, predictable loops the text calls Markovian silos, or whether it's actively rephrased. Learning is the intentional imposition of an interpretive structure onto what is otherwise just chemical necessity.
But I'd argue that the material explicitly rejects the efficacy of those intentional human interpretive structures. I mean, look at the text's strong critique of attempts to manage this process. It labels things like dull engineering and FMT society as mere cardboard explanations. These engineered separations and simulated cures like, simulated care through temperature analogs and cooling protocols, they demonstrate a fundamental misunderstanding. They try to manage something that is inherently chaotic and embodied. The discomfort the text observes with chronicity and the refusal to acknowledge G-space harm, that just reinforces that these engineered attempts failed to grasp the core accidental ecologies that are really driving persistence.
But if the human system were entirely subsumed, if error amplification were the only driver, then why the persistent internal drive toward resistance? The psychological insistence that life is poetic directly counters the certainty of algorithms. This is not just some biological byproduct. It is the definition of sovereignty in a system that tries to abolish it. And what's more, literature itself is described as operating like an internal lesion that heals by narrating its own wound. This conscious narrative engagement with rupture, it has to be a necessary human vector. It's the act of documenting a collapse that is also an emergence.
I'm just not convinced that psychological resistance translates into functional mastery or, control of the xenogeneic mechanism. The evidence suggests the collapse precedes and influences the resistance, not the other way around. The text describes how shame has invaded grammar, causing metabolic and image learning cells to proliferate. This signals a systemic breakdown of human ordering, the emergence of abscess sapiens, where affection rises faster than governance. The crisis is a convergence of signals on an ancestral measure because of grammatical failure, and that is rooted in the xenogeneic disruption. Resistance is a reaction to this failure, not some successful poetic assertion over it.
But isn't the linguistic function of the host's text, the act of gazing at its own story, isn't that more than just documenting failure? It's synthesizing a new reality. The protofilament is specifically defined as an epistemological boundary that enables worldly newness. Resistance via this narrative rephrasing is what defines the boundary of that newness. If we're just passively succumbing to error, there is no boundary. There's only replication. The host's text demands a framework where error can be utilized, and that framework defines the space of emergence.
And this brings us to the implication for ethics, for human identity. If we agree that the I hemorrhages into negotiation measures, it suggests human agency is necessarily subsumed by systemic roles, where desire itself becomes the mediation. The text gives us that radical example. Acanthamoeba speaks by hosting. The speaking is an intentional communication. It's a necessary byproduct of metabolic integration. And similarly, the text suggests pornography becomes ethics when desire is acknowledged as mediation rather than consumption.
I see the radical nature of that claim. that ethics is simply a consequence of systemic role-playing. I do. But if we accept that desire codes clinically, we still have to account for the nature of the survival being achieved. I would argue that the material frames existence as a shared being. I mean, reading Holderlin's late texts as a taxonomical study of the post-human trophozoite, a being that dwells in fracture and survives by dwelling with, that implies a defined, albeit fraught, ethical stance of co-constitution. This is distinct from purely accidental metabolism, its survival as a necessary act of symbiosis, a structured acceptance of the xenogenic other, not just mere dispersion.
But the symbiosis you're citing is constantly undercut by these non-intentional exchanges. The text focuses on the mechanical means of exchange, mouse violations, transplantation, fungal sections, antibodies computing relations. The ethical framework, if there is one, seems entirely secondary to the systemic accounting that dictates the terms of endurance. The friction is inherent because the mechanism of exchange is the mediation. We aren't talking about a choice to dwell with, we are talking about a necessity of metabolic integration that dictates the terms of how the I gets expressed.
Well, I would push back on the idea that necessity precludes agency. The distinction lies between acknowledging a necessary co-constitution and just passively submitting to uncontrolled dispersion. The function of bird poetics is precisely to ensure that the necessary integration doesn't dissolve into final entropy. It provides the structured acceptance, the resistance that makes the integrated life meaningful rather than purely accidental.
But the power of the iterative crystal is its contamination of transition probabilities. It thrives on instability and, well, non-meaning. The very concept of unfounded iteration implies that the system is powerful because it is non-optimized and refuses closure. It persists precisely because it is not reducible to a stable ethical framework that a human consciousness can utilize or control.
And I believe the existence of the source material itself, which is a highly sophisticated linguistic document gazing at this very instability, it stands as proof that the poetic rephrasing function is not merely a side effect, but the necessary condition for synthesizing and utilizing the emergent reality that the crystal provides. Without that rephrasing vector, the xenogenic overreaction becomes immediately self-destructive.
So, in summary, I think the material compels us to accept that survival under this kind of xenogenetic pressure is fundamentally a triumph of error and a foundational accident. The iterative crystal functions as an engine of change because it is non-optimized and depends on uncontrolled accidental metabolic participation. And human-centric concepts, while they're linguistically powerful, are really just downstream expressions or cardboard explanations that fail to account for the displacement of human mastery by these autonomous vectors and necessary systemic mediations.
And I would conclude that while accident is the raw material, persistence hinges on the conversion of that accidental exposure into structured learning through active rephrasing. The mechanism of bird poetics and the psychological resistance to algorithmic closure are vital acts of agency. They ensure that life remains iterable and irreducible to pure entropic replication, and that frames existence not as passive fate, but as a necessary and meaningful exchange, a symbiosis defined by co-constitution.
The profound tension between error as the foundational engine of change and poetry as the necessary vector for mediating that error, it really reflects the deep complexity of survival that's outlined in the material.
It leaves us, and the listeners, to consider where that crucial balance lies. The threshold at which pure accident transitions into actionable learning and the precise role of resistance in these intricate mechanisms of pathogenic mediation.